I'm so happy to see everybody here, and I already recognize a lot of the names. This is part of a much larger project, book project, that I started a long time ago, and the involvement of the 92nd Street Y and its relationship to what's usually called the downtown art community is part of a larger work on the political involvements of a group of Yiddish-speaking, left-wing artists, painters, lithographers, sculptors, cartoonists, and others from the teens to basically to the late 1930s. And so this is a very important part of that. And I was thrilled actually to be able to dig into the archives here again. The last time I was here, they weren't as well organized. That was a long time ago. And so I really, really do appreciate it. The fellowship was well used. It is often thought that stark divisions existed between uptown, more establishment institutions, like this one, and politically radical artists who held shows in popular venues, like settlement houses, and published their art in left-wing Yiddish journals. However, a closer look suggests otherwise. A thorough look at the 92nd Street Y, both its archives and its published materials, especially in their bulletin that started in the 1930s, expands our image of Jewish visual artists in interwar New York and a little bit earlier, and suggests some ways in which artists and aesthetic programs united disparate sectors of the Jewish community in areas that proved challenging in other areas, in other arenas. So in the first decades of the 20th century, along with the millions of Jewish immigrants who were fleeing Eastern Europe and other countries for the shores of America, a surprisingly strong community of budding artists either came to the United States as children or were born here as children of immigrants, mostly on New York's Lower East Side. Their talents were fostered in specifically Jewish and also non-Jewish settings, places like the anarchist Ferrer School, where the famed realist so-called Ashcan artists like Robert Henry and John Sloan taught, to the most prolific of all immigrant educational institutions, the Educational Alliance Art School, where artist Abo Ostrowski reignited and refounded an older art school when he opened it in 1917. And it is extraordinary if you look at even a partial list of people who studied at the Educational Alliance Art School, including people like Ben Shahn, and also taught there, Ben Shahn, Chaim Gross, all three Sawyer brothers, Moses, Raphael, and Isaac Sawyer, the sculptor Louise Nevelson, and another sculptor who's less well known, Dina Melikov, and the incredible Max Weber was also involved, Abraham Wolkowitz, the list goes on and on. So already there is an incredible art community percolating on the Lower East Side by the 19-teens. Some of these artists, many of them were also social ideologues, believing that they needed to bring art to the people in both classes and exhibitions of their work and others. Pioneers like John Weichsel founded the so-called People's Art Guild in 1917, which was not a nominally Jewish institution, but essentially it was. He was Jewish, and most of the people who exhibited and were involved with the People's Art Guild were Jews, and mostly immigrants. And his idea in his exhibitions was that art needed to escape the rarefied air of museums and uptown art galleries and go to meet the people where they were, where they lived and where they worked. In this case, the people, of course, meant poor immigrants, and with little higher education and even less time to go and travel, usually, to museums. So Weichsel staged exhibits of the work of dozens of artists in downtown cheap restaurants, on their walls, in settlement houses, in libraries, and in other public spaces. The 1920s, brought more opportunities for art in the downtown community, from the Jewish Art Center, which was another short-lived venture, but very important, founded by the artist and poet Jennings Toffel, also known by his Yiddish name Yehuda Toffel, and Benjamin Kopman. And they held both classes and exhibitions at the Jewish Art Center, to expanded class offerings at the Educational Alliance, which continued to grow throughout the 1920s, to illustrated Yiddish journals and newspapers, especially I want to mention Der Größer Kundes, which was a journal of satire and humor, and had amazing illustrations throughout it, and that lasted from 1909 to 1927. And also a little bit later than that, the Morgenfreiheit, the daily newspaper of the Yiddish-speaking communist wing of the Communist Party, founded in 1922, and the Freiheit-associated monthly journal Der Hammer, which was founded in 1926, and which included not only illustrations and even some photographs, but the most incredible, vibrant color covers that were, many of which were lithographs by many left-leaning artists. There were also illustrations in other newspapers and literary journals as well. And so, for instance, the very elite, small circulation literary journal Schriften, which was published in the 19-teens and 20s, and published the work of, for instance, Max Weber, both his line drawings and also his poems. Don't know if you knew that he was a poet. These all added to this really exciting atmosphere of art kind of in every corner of the downtown Jewish world. And it also included elaborate stage settings that were created for the phenomenally successful Yiddish theater. In addition to the aesthetic interests that these ventures shared, it is undeniable that their location in the teeming immigrant communities of downtown New York and their generally left-leaning politics were also salient features of the city's Jewish art world. When most people think of the 92nd Street Y and its history of art classes and exhibitions, though, they often don't link it to all of these concerns of downtown immigrant New York. In looking, though, at the personnel of the Wise Art Center, the teaching philosophies, the exhibitions, and the lecture series that were held here, and even the administrative choices and fee structures of the Wise Art Department, it becomes evident that from the beginning, this, what is now almost 90-year-old Upper East Side institution, was integrally linked to the larger Jewish art world in New York and beyond. What we now know as the Y on 92nd and Lex was actually born downtown, and after a series of moves in Midtown Manhattan, settled right here on the Upper East Side on land donated by financier Jacob Schiff. The original building, built in 1900, though, was completely torn down and rebuilt between 1929 and 1930, and when the expanded new center opened, the building finally had space for art studios, and that was actually one of the first priorities of the administration. By the end of that year, in October of 1930, the Wise Educational Department had formed an art department. Only 2 classes were offered at first, but they would establish subject matter and instructors that would help shape the cultural life of the Y and of New York, its Jewish community and beyond, for decades to come. Painter Reuben Leaf taught a course that he called Arts and Crafts, and then expanded that into a whole Arts and Crafts center. And the noted painter and lithographer Saul Raskin taught drawing and painting, and became the first director of the Art Center here. During the Depression, attendees at the Y's public programs and classes were exposed to a wide range of techniques as the curriculum grew and the number of classes grew. Arts and Crafts director Reuben Leaf offered a full selection, ultimately, of classes and lectures in wood cutting and printing and ceramics and classes like that, ranging from practical instruction to theoretical lectures on art history and philosophy. He believed, as he said, quote, that the Wise Arts and Crafts classes were not intended and planned as strict professional courses in the study of different branches of applied arts, but as a rich variety of opportunities. And he believed very strongly in this, in the center here, not being a professional school and really welcoming everybody of any level of talent. Saul Raskin, who already had quite a reputation when he was hired as art director, both as a painter and also as somebody involved in many of those institutions that I mentioned earlier. He was a cartoonist for Drugor Secundus. He was involved in left-wing Yiddishist institutions like the Arbeiterring, the Workmen's Circle downtown, and he also had positions at the Metropolitan Museum, and he also had taught at the Educational Alliance Art School. So he had really been kind of all over the place by the time he was hired here in 1930. And he was invited to not only be the director, but to teach drawing and painting and to organize exhibitions. He often made his own work the center of those exhibitions, at least once a year, and he advertised his upcoming exhibitions of his latest work, both in the Y Bulletin and also in other media, including the New York Times. And in the archives, I actually found handwritten notes that he sent to various publications with his text for exactly how they should announce not only the contents of the exhibition, but exact wording, quote, noted artist, noted painter and lithographer Saul Raskin unveils his latest offerings and whatever. So he did not suffer from lack of ego. Despite his undeniable tendency, however, towards self-promotion, Raskin was very dedicated to promoting the work of other, often less well-known artists. He also felt strongly about exposing immigrants and other members of the Jewish community, especially people who did not have much art education or other higher education, to great works of art. Continuing a program that he had started for the Workmen's Circle, for the Arbeiterring, he took groups of people starting at the Y in 1932 for what he called gallery walks, and especially to different sections of the Metropolitan Museum with each visit. And he lectured to them about the so-called great masters and the art heritage of both East and West. And his gallery walks would create a tradition of museum visits and lectures that continued in the Y's art department long after he had left. As a member, as I said, of the Workmen's Circle, Arbeiterring, and other left-leaning groups, Raskin also included openly leftist artists and their work in Y exhibitions, here Uptown. One Russian-born painter named Frank Horowitz, for instance, was given a solo exhibit in the main hall of the Y that we just walked into upon his return from several months visiting the Soviet Union, where he had spent time in the newly created Jewish colony of Azerbaijan, before it was actually named that, in the eastern USSR. The idea for a Soviet-based Jewish homeland, an alternative to Zionism, had been introduced in 1928. Azerbaijan itself was not actually inaugurated and truly organized until 1934, but supporters of the idea had been raising money through an organization called IKOR, the Organization for Jewish Colonization in Russia, for a number of years before that. And it was through their auspices that Frank Horowitz, this artist, along with 3 other artists, visited the region and observed the establishment of Jewish agricultural colonies. Enthusiastic about the possibilities for Jews and others in a reorganized Soviet society, Horowitz painted, you have to remember, of course, this is, late 20s, early 30s, before the purges began in 1934 and before many of the revelations, what was actually going on there. Horowitz painted pictures with themes like Afternoon in a Jewish Colony, or New School, Colony Ikor, in a colony actually named for the organization, and Caucasian Colonist, as in somebody in the Caucasus, not white. His work was shown in the main hall here, as I said, and the New York Herald Tribune, among many, many other press comments that I found in the archives, called the show forceful and painted with vigor. The Y's internal bulletin ambiguously deemed the show most unusual. But there were many accolades. It was really incredible. At least 15 or 20 different publications covered this show. The warmth with which Horowitz portrayed his subjects vouched for the efficacy of the Soviet colonization program and, by extension, for the success of the Soviet system as a whole. Although, in hindsight, we know that most of these colonies failed, both agriculturally and economically, and that most of the original settlers fled, some even died in its early years. The idea of a Jewish autonomous region in an area previously known for Tsarist abuses and Jewish confinement to the Pale of Settlement was attractive even to many people whose personal philosophies were very far from communism. Although the movement's base was among the Yiddish-speaking socialist masses in downtown Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Bronx by now in the 30s, many middle and upper-class Jews also donated funds to the colony. One of ECOR's most generous early donors, for instance, was Julius Rosenwald of Sears Roebuck fame. It is in this context, then, that a show like Frank Horowitz's, with positive Soviet images, could have been mounted and have enjoyed success here in the Upper East Side's glossy new exhibition space. This provides a further example of uptown-downtown cooperation in what might otherwise have been viewed as a surprising partnership. Another example of openly left-wing views that entered these halls through the art department was a series of lectures in 1933 on art in modern society, given by a very respected art critic, Jerome Klein, who also was a Marxist. In his four-part series, Klein touched on the relationship between arts and society in the West, beginning in the Renaissance, proceeding through the Enlightenment, etc. On the surface, these divisions were fairly standard ones, unless you look at the subtopics that he wrote in his lectures. For instance, his talk on 17th century explored such themes as the artist as an individual producer for an open market, and a later one discussed the bourgeois revolution, Daumier and the proletariat, and Courbet and socialism. Most telling of all was his final lecture, The New Objectivity and Its Class Implications, which, according to the author, dealt with cultural liquidation, officialdom discredited, the radical artist as a standard bearer, etc., and the class struggle. Despite the fact that he was a fairly well-known critic, there was also no charge for this series at his request, perhaps an indication that the dissemination of his ideas was more important to him than the fees he might have otherwise commanded as a speaker. Likewise, the renowned art critic Meyer Shapiro gave several series of lectures here as well. In 1934, William Kolodny joined the Y as education director and began to enhance and transform many of the educational programs, including those of the art department. By 1935, the program had expanded to include classes in photography, caricature and cartooning, life drawing, design and commercial art, etching, sculpture, metal crafts, and jewelry. In 35 and 36, very important development happened when the Y began to cooperate with the WPA and its FAP, or Federal Art Program. And they offered through that program daytime courses for what they called serious art students, and these were free of charge, although people had to buy their materials. They were now joined by Saul Raskin's successor, the artist and administrator Aaron Berkman. And another important connection I found to the general Jewish and left-wing art world was that Berkman, I hadn't realized this before, was a co-founder of the ACA Art Gallery, very important artist collective and politically left-leaning art gallery that, among other things in this era, mounted the largest exhibition in the country of anti-lynching art in 1936. So the co-founder of this gallery would become the director of the art program here. Although these externally subsidized programs ended in the late 1930s, and ultimately the FAP closed, as we know, this really profoundly expanded the offerings and the range of talent through the Wise Art Center. It included some interesting instructors here during those years. For instance, a multifaceted character and talented painter named Samuel Mostel, whom we would come to know by his nickname Zero. and very talented painter. As we know, of course, he would later be blacklisted during the McCarthy era for his political activities. Many of the instructors who came through the WPA program did leave after that, but Berkman remained now as the director of the art program, and that concludes this sort of era of the art center that I'm talking about. So to conclude, what do we glean from all of this? That the 92nd Street Y in the 1930s was not, as many people might think from a distance, some kind of remote uptown location, but rather it was an integral part of the Jewish and the general modern art world, and the left-wing, in many cases, the left-wing art circles in New York and elsewhere. It linked many interconnected strands of educational, social, political, and aesthetic involvement between its teachers and organizers, its students, and its visiting exhibitors. The world of Jewish art in the early 20th century was certainly enhanced as a result. Thank you.